All right. This could also simply be titled Counterpoint, but I think that would just be rude. It's interesting to me that one of the worst behaviors of human beings is acknowledged a heck of a lot more readily when a computer does it instead. Specifically, how many people here have dealt with a colleague who takes an approach to things of being consistently yet authoritatively wrong about things? I have a colleague like that. This human crapsack is named Steven. His entire approach is, I don't actually know the answer, so I'm going to guess while sounding incredibly and unjustifiably confident in the answer that I give. And that's a problem when it starts impacting the security space. Like, yes, this is how you secure an S3 bucket. Awesome. Or, I spun up a bunch of security observability tooling, but it kept alerting it was noisy, so I silenced the alarms. I mean, what could it know? Probably the alarm was shorting out or something. Or perhaps most germane to this specific moment in time, we need a keynote speaker. Find someone competent that can do the job. I'm Quinn, and I fix AWS bills for a living and also speak commonly in my first language spoken at home, which is sarcasm. Security and cost exist on the same axis, as in they're things you care about right after you really should have cared about them. It's very much a reactive problem space. Yeah, I know this is quite the title, but you're legally not allowed to give a talk in 2024 that does not feature AI prominently. What I think makes this talk a little on the rare side is that I'm not trying to sell you anything through the power of AI, which is basically uncharted territory. Have you noticed that everything these days, from cybersecurity to writing code to corporate strategy to this freaking toothbrush, now come bristling with AI? Bristling. How did we ever manage to brush our teeth without machine learning and incredibly expensive compute thrown at it? It's as if we have lately immediately tossed out everything that resembles good sense in favor of climbing aboard the not stopping, constantly accelerating hype train. And nowhere has this become more evident than in conference expo halls. If you walk the RSA Expo Hall this week, which I strongly advise you do not do for reasons of your own sanity, you're going to see a bunch of products that are offering security through the power of AI. I mean, honestly, good for them. This talk would not have been accepted at any time in the last 20 years at RSA because the title does not include the word firewall. So maybe things are starting to evolve a little bit. And some of these booths that you're going to see here are going to be selling you security through AI to fend off the threat posed by AI, as well as using AI to do it, which starts to feel a bit conflict of interest-y. Almost like an insurance salesperson who dabbles in arson to wind up hitting quota targets every month. It's, to be a little less unfair to some of these companies, AI is so new that nobody really has wrapped their head around where it fits in the security landscape. And I think that part of the problem that we're seeing and why so many of these things seem unhinged is that it comes down to a fundamental truth that I think we're all mostly aware of by the time we hit a certain level of seniority, that we don't necessarily like to admit, specifically that you cannot fix people problems with technology, though Lord knows that doesn't stop us from trying constantly. We all have examples of this. The most recent security one that's near and dear to my heart from my personal experience is having to go through the required annual security awareness training that we are contractually mandated to do. Because remember, if you click the wrong link in an email, you might destroy the company. Now, as an industry, I think that we've failed at security. If some random accountant or admin assistant or person in marketing clicking on the wrong link in an email can bring the company to its collective knees, but we treat this as if we can somehow train people enough so that it's never going to happen with endless hours of training. And now, we're going to just throw AI on top of all these things as a panacea. And so many of these pitches are now talking about how you can get people out of things. So start preemptively laying people off because this is going to be awesome. I'm old. And I'm tired. And I'm sick of the hype. We've all seen the Gartner hype cycle, I presume. I perpetually live in this part of it about almost everything. I am still the guy that is waiting for the year of the Linux desktop on containers in the cloud. So I'm perpetually disappointed here. But we've seen this all before. This time we're told that it's different because it's AI. And it is, because the subtly dangerous part of AI is that it does a great job of pretending to reason. It doesn't think, but it acts and presents for all the world as if it does. Like Stephen. Never be Stephen. We will again come back to this. Gen AI, as it works today, is fundamentally a very well executed parlor trick. And it is very well executed. If you're aware of how GPUs are sold and priced and rented, it is also an exceedingly and astonishingly expensive parlor trick. And that is part of the reason we're seeing even an early rush to monetize these things. The products aren't built yet, but they're already upfront charging per seat for these things because otherwise it is ruinously expensive. That's not just because we're now in a zero interest rate environment where money costs something again. It's because these things are terrifying to pay for. But it's still just a trick. It is a very advanced text prediction engine. It's not thinking, but by acting and presenting as if it does, it lulls us into the dangerous belief that we can outsource thinking and, by extension, decision-making to computers. This slide comes from an IBM presentation the last time that it was really relevant to a technical conversation in 1979. And back then, the most unthinkable thing a computer could apparently do was put the wrong person on the layoff list because that's somebody important's nephew, and that was their concern then. Now today, great. Computers can lay people off on a good day, but on a bad day, cars drive themselves. Traffic lights are computer controlled. I've worked in finance for most of my career. I've been at BlackRock. I was at Expensify. But the scariest job that I've ever had was a brief stint I had at Grindr, where that was the only job I've had before or since where if I screwed up the data protection, people could die. Compared to that, I sleep well at night when it's only money. And it's not a popular thing to say in most boardrooms. It's only money. But there is an element of truth to that. And that's important. And pay attention to it, because for all of its modern-day faults, IBM got this very right. One of the key tenets of modern contract law and modern society is that we are held accountable for the consequences of our decisions when those decisions have negative externalities. When decisions have positive consequences instead, we're not held responsible, even given credit. The credit is stolen from us by Stephen. Okay, why am I continually making the same Stephen joke? Good question. It's intentional, but it's also not really my intention. Despite the title of this talk about AI dooming us, don't mistake me for an AI doomsayer, or doomer, as the modern generation of children like to call it. It is a useful tool in the right context. I use it to brainstorm things because I am technologically curious. Generative AI wrote an earlier and somehow crappier version of this talk. I'm just a better speaker, which is why I'm the one that gives our talk. And yes, it's our talk. I share credit because I am, again, not Stephen. And I'm not entirely kidding here. It did spit out an early draft that I then edited the bare outline and fixed all of its mistakes along the way, because I consider myself a professional. It's also a talk at a security conference, but it is not security itself. Even in this sense, though, letting AI run amok and do whatever it wants and not having humans oversee or review what it puts out would be a bit of a concern for a talk, but disastrous for all of you in the security space, I hope. If you're having AI write security policies and not reviewing them, I'm predicting some problems and tears before bedtime. Because even without letting security touch this stuff, letting Gen AI speak to the world on your behalf without being filtered through a human is dangerously unhinged. Every once in a while, it'd like to come up with things for this talk that would violate codes of conduct and basic standards of human decency. And for examples of this, you can see a lot of them if you check your email spam folder from some cold outreach that salespeople have been sending out, customized to each recipient through Gen AI, and you can tell that's what's going on because they make zero sense at even a casual reading. And amusingly, I did have this talk edited not just by ChatGPT, which is how you do pronounce it, but also by GitHub Copilot. See, this is a true story. This is not PowerPoint or Keynote that I'm using. This is a custom JavaScript framework that I've been working on that winds up presenting my slides, so I can write these things as a fancy markdown file that just gets rendered. And what that means is that Copilot, ostensibly a coding assistant, likes to tab complete lines where it gets repetitive and keeps coming up with Stephen jokes, for example. And as I'm doing it, it does come up with some strange stuff. Like, you think I have issues with Stephen, it's worse. Although when it tab completed the line for this slide, it's hard not to read "the robots are going to kill us all" as something of a threat when a robot writes it. I'm sure that's not concerning. Let's move on before we look too deeply into that hole. The point is that this technology has some relatively serious flaws. And an easy example here is that even Nostradamus himself could not have predicted this, that not only is this stuff expensive, it is hilariously bad at math. Think about that. The last time that you could get a very expensive computer that was bad at math was back in the 1990s. See, I told you I was old. Thankfully, I'm not the only one here. If I were giving this to a bunch of millennials, no one would know what the hell I was talking about. Now, I am old, but I wasn't always old. I was once a young man until I was 23. And then I got my first job as a Unix systems administrator, and boom, old. When you support computers for a living, you become very conservative very quickly around certain things. I'm the last kid on my block to adopt a new file system, because you're almost always in a situation where the benefits are going to be massively outweighed by the potential downsides of that. When it comes to production databases of my own, I use very old, tried and tested versions because mistakes are going to show. Now, for other people, when I'm thought leading on the internet, I suggest they use Route 53 or another managed DNS server as their production database because it amuses me, and it's not my production environment to worry about. Maybe you don't run your bank on top of it, though. It's an occupational hazard for folks with an operations or admin background in that we become cynical. We've been through enough cycles where today's shiny new hyped up nonsense becomes tomorrow's legacy garbage that we're stuck supporting in perpetuity. But you know what else I'm cynical and conservative around? Is security. I bet you wondered when I was going to get this talk around to the point of being security and why it fits here and it's not completely irrelevant. I'm getting there, and that time is now. Because when cynicism is your worldview, you start to pattern match on specific things. And now, right now, the subtextual messaging around everything is hurry up and get on board with AI lest you miss out. And that should set off quiet alarm bells. Where have we heard lately, hurry up and get on board or you're going to miss the revolution? Remember blockchain? How suddenly everyone was all in on cryptocurrency and you had to get in or miss out entirely? And it still appears that there's not a real use case for blockchain other than fraud and being very adjacent to fraud/speculation. I mean, speaking as someone old, get in now or miss out has never been true at any point in my career. It's been a sales pressure tactic. I got into cloud seriously back in 2015. I learned Kubernetes this past January, and I think I'm doing fine adopting a measured approach to technology in areas where mistakes will absolutely show. And speaking as a conference attendee who also has a company where we do give a toss about security, even if it is only money, and I'm looking at what products to roll out, I am extremely skeptical when this is the pitch for products, talking about all the things it's going to do soon instead of what it does today. Security is important. You might not recognize that or know it given the repeated lackadaisical security approach that some companies named Microsoft apparently love to take to it, but it is. And it's worth taking the time to get it right. I want to be clear here. I am not saying that you should not adopt generative AI as a part of your workflow. I'm not dumb enough to try to fight this particular tide. But you are security people. And ideally, how is this thing going to fail should be the first question that you ask of anything that touches your realm, which is kind of a lot. Take AWS and their IAM policies. Does anyone here know how to write a non-trivial IAM policy that doesn't just blanket allow everything from scratch, off the top of their head, with no notes? I sure don't. But she does. This looks, for all the world, like I spent $2.99 on a stock photo image of someone. No, this is my friend and director at AWS Identity, Bridget Johnson. She is actually writing an IAM policy in this photo. It looks like the next picture in the series should be her laughing alone while eating salad to hit the trope. But she is an arcane space wizard from the future who writes these things live on Twitch with an audience. But I can't, and you can't. And most disturbingly, ChatGPT can't. Now, it's too busy beating the Stephen joke to death, and while I absolutely endorse beating Stephen to death, I'd also like it to write a proper IAM policy when asked, or else tell me that it can't. But instead, it is confidently wrong. I asked ChatGPT to write an AWS SCP for me, granting access to every S3 bucket. Note how confident it is. Note the assuredness with which it answers. There's only one slight problem here. Can anyone spot it? Go ahead. Exactly. That's the second issue. You can't apply an SCP to the parent account, and SCPs don't grant permissions. They can only restrict them. Now, this one is blindingly obviously wrong the first time you try to apply it and it errors. But what about subtle problems? AWS has an automated reasoning group, and they wind up doing a lot of work to make sure that things make sense, and they still miss this. Nick Frechette is a staff security researcher at Tinder for Pets, I think is what they do. They're called Date a Dog. Anyway, in isolation, every step along this vulnerability makes perfect sense when AWS set things up and tore them down, but then it leaves things dangling that were then assumable publicly. But it was the interaction of complex systems here that caused the problem. That is how most security issues happen in sophisticated ways these days. It's not just open S3 buckets or passwords that haven't been changed, ideally. There's a complex interplay of these things at work. And AWS is pretty good at this. I talked earlier about how you can't fix people problems with technology. And it's true. But you can make people's processes better or worse with the application of technology. I get some flack for saying that when it comes to the security and ranking the three big clouds by security, that Google Cloud is #1 and AWS is #2. Azure is not on the list because it gave up on the race halfway through to go eat some crayons at the kids' table. But the reason that I say isn't that Google AWS's defense in-depth approach is misguided, or that they aren't at the absolute top of their game. They are. Like, which is technically better from a raw capability perspective comes down to who had what for breakfast that morning. AWS, by default, grants no permissions to anything. Google Cloud, by default, allows everything within a project to speak to everything else within that project. And that is a subtle but important difference. Now, on paper, you could make a strong argument that the default deny everything is the stronger posture, because in absolute computer terms, you are right. The problem is people. At an enterprise, when you have an entire apparatus, which generally looks like, you people, what do you mean, you people? Security types. To handle that, you're not wrong. But remember, as I said, you can't fix people with technology. And the problem is what happens with the rest of us who don't have that apparatus are going to wind up having a challenge here. And they're going to, and even in your environment, they might go around security or ignore policies and processes, which we all know that none of our employees would ever do once Stephen is finally fired, because he's the only one. Now, you try to do a thing in AWS, and it fails. So you expand the IAM permissions for the role, and you do it again. And you rinse, and you repeat. Now, if you're using CloudFormation to do this, great. It's going to take a few minutes. It's a lot faster if you use ClickOps, which is using the AWS console and then lying about using the AWS console. It's a best practice. And essentially, at some point, this is what happens. This is an actual screenshot from one of my AWS accounts for code build, where you can see iteratively, as I wind up adding different levels of permissions to expand it. Does this work? Does this work? Does this work? Screw it. I'm going to allow administrator access. And I'm going to say, and I put a to-do there of go back and fix this later. The problem is that to-do has been there since 2018. Now, fortunately, this is an account where there's zero confidential data that lives in there, merely my pride if this thing winds up getting stolen. But that is still the case today, because getting the permissions dialed in just right is incredibly hard. And there's always something better or more important to do than go back and fix the load-bearing to-dos. You can't fight human nature. And the danger here is if you take a confident GenAI config that passes a syntax check but fails in remarkably subtle ways, the odds are terrific that even during review, a human is not going to catch those corner and vertex cases. Even AWS themselves ships subtly broken policies from time to time. A while back, Scott Piper saw this one go through on Twitter. They reverted it within 8 hours, but they granted S3 read access to any S3 bucket for the unremovable AWS support role. Now, their response is actually pretty great, because it talks about how this was a mistake, but here are other things that guarantee this was never actually used, and you can validate it yourself by looking at the audit logs in your account through the following ways. That demonstrated on some level a value of defense in depth. It valued that they earned the trust that they need to function in this. There is a bar for trust, and they cleared it very well. And it is a high bar. So when you, as a random vendor, tell me that you've got this amazing generative AI-powered security offering that is miraculously more than vaporware delivered at a conference, you've got to be sure to convince me and the rest of your buying audience that the mistakes that GenAI will absolutely make will be caught by a compensating control of some kind, ideally several of them. If you don't directly state up front that your AI system will hallucinate, which means lie, I don't trust you. And I can't, because that is how the technology works for now. And if you aren't upfront with acknowledging that, that's deeply unfortunate. And human nature, combined with that grim reality, brings me to one inescapable conclusion as I see people piling into this, that GenAI is right now not in the report that we just had shown to us by Alon, but it is one of the greatest threats out there because of both the hype and the resulting intense and insane levels of pressure to adopt it, coming from the highest levels of every organization today. It is not ready for security prime time, where it matters, where it counts, but it's being sold as if it is, and that's a problem. I didn't see that in the list of competitive threats right now in Alon's presentation, just because they didn't ask me before publishing this version of the report for some reason. But I stand by this assessment. I am not telling you not to adopt GenAI. I know no one here has that kind of juice right now to buck an entire hype trend. What I am saying is to please be extraordinarily cautious when you do. In other words, think. Because it's the only thing that is stopping a computer from taking your job is the ability to reason. After all, you are security people. The rest of society depends upon you to lesser or greater extents, whether they acknowledge it or not. We are all stocked up on free credit monitoring at this point. You are the last bulwark against that darkness, but you must think and not outsource that job to an overly confident computer, because otherwise we are all doomed. I'm Corey Quinn. I think AI is going to doom us all, but at least it'll be entertaining as it does it. Thank you for listening to me go off. If there are questions up to and including of the form, what the hell is wrong with you? I am thrilled to field them. Also, feel free to assault me afterwards in a darkened alley with some broken beer bottles because I just basically took a pot shot at your company's bow. Awesome. All of these are fine. There's always the ever-popular conference Q&A portion of the dramatic reading of your own resume. That's popular. Go ahead. Oh, thank you. I think we were thinking of a runner for you for a microphone as well, because... Yes, but the trick is always whether people can hear it on the recording.
Hi, this is kind of weird now. Great presentation, really enjoyed the digs at Microsoft. Agree with everything you said, but so what do we do? It's coming. It's not like Bitcoin and blockchain. It's coming. It's going to stay. So what do we do?
It is. You're right. My approach, which again is not a panacea and is going to vary case by case, implementation by implementation. I've seen companies already launch things. Oh, this just tell it your requirements. It will generate an IAM policy for you. Great. There needs to be a level of human review of people who understand how these things function in areas when it matters. And it's a sliding scale. It is not a binary. In very small test accounts where you want to have it build a security policy, great, start there. The blast radius is small. But by the time you go from that to multinational bank, there has to be some additional work put on top of it. You also have to approach the idea of, okay, generative AI does go out to lunch sometimes and goes completely haywire. Sure, it happens less frequently with more mature models as time goes on, but assume it's going to happen on some level. I mean, at scale, 1 in a million things happen multiple times a minute. So there's a question of, assume that the absolute worst happens, how do we have compensating controls to address and catch those things before face impacts road, for lack of a better term? And an awful lot of the stuff that's very excited right now and getting trotted out instantly, like the swath of startups that just found themselves out of a business model as soon as OpenAI announced the ability that could work on PDF files. It's, okay, someone didn't put more than first order thinking into potential next steps into their ideas. That's what scares me. Because there's a lot of areas where you can see this stuff doing interesting things, and if it fails, your chatbot on the website breaks or promises customers deals that don't exist, which is just embarrassing to the company, not ruinously damaging to customers from a security posture. But there are things in which you can joke and be lighthearted around, and there are things that need to be taken incredibly seriously. And even security is one of those spectrum things. If I'm Twitter for Pets, for example, which apparently is folding soon, because while it turns out we can get dogs to tweet, they are nowhere near racist enough to make something like Twitter work. So, but great, if that has a security issue, it's not the end of the world. Whereas something like a dating site for people who are not out, that is a massive security blast radius. Somewhere between those two extremes, there becomes an escalating series of points of having to be mature and responsible about this on the continuum. That's the point that I'm trying to get at. Great question. Yes? The light's in my eyes. I can't see who's raising their hands. Awesome.
So in a world where we keep talking about machine-on-machine attacking, AI on AI attacking, what is the likelihood that we're going to hear of a breach where one AI tool misleads another AI tool?
The odds that we hear about it are going to be almost 100%, because it basically makes for an interesting story when someone wants to be the top of that week's news cycle in the tech space. Whether it actually happens that way versus that's the story that gets told afterwards, like, oh, a computer on a computer wound up doing an exploit and that's what happened, instead of us being sloppy with credential management or other misconfigurations. It's more defensible if you have a novel attack story as we were attacked by a very sophisticated adversary, namely a lying thinking computer, than oops, we forgot to do the usual basic brush your teeth and eat your vegetables approach. Whether or not that is something that we will see down the road, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of, let's face it, using coding assistance, you can generate exploits much more effectively. It's effectively built out a tab complete your way through life approach it's a lot faster than just copying and pasting from Stack Overflow. Computers are faster at that than we are. It still leads to really weird code quality. It turns into what is in many cases a strong sense of forgetting how these things work. But whether or not, I'm not convinced that that is the greatest threat to all of us. I think that is going to be an overhyped threat for the time being. What this looks like 3 generations of foundation model from now, I don't know. If I can actually predict the future, I would be doing something more lucrative than making fun of Microsoft. I can't even predict what their lawsuit is going to say inevitably when they've had enough of my slander. They have a spite budget for legal things that just exceeds mine for whatever reason. This is why we kick up at multi-trillion-dollar companies when we can't plan things through and see the consequences of our actions that are obvious in hindsight. But I don't know. I think right now the problem is if computers can wind up finding the holes in these things, so can humans. You're never going to defeat a truly determined, unlimitedly resourced adversary, but you can defeat the script kiddies running scanners on things to find open S3 buckets. It's a continuum, and you want to at least raise the bar of you must be at least this sophisticated to break in. I mean, at some point, you're an interesting enough adversary, people start sending people to take jobs at your company. the true insider threat are the suborn people who work there or get their folks hired into positions of trust. And at some point, how do I defend against that? I don't. But I'm also nowhere near interesting enough to be worth that kind of resource attack. But I am going to mostly scope down my IAM permissions just as soon as I'm finished with this talk. I have a pending to-do item on that. Other questions, comments, concerns, criticisms, personal attacks, ever popular as well.
Hi. So I agree with most of what you say, but I think there is a fundamental flaw, right? When we look at cars that drive autonomously, right, we would say, I'm not saying there will be no accidents anymore. I'm just saying they're better than humans at some point, right? Now, the question we have to ask about AI in security is not, is it amazing? Is it better than the average security engineer that doesn't know a lot about cloud, right? Like, that's really the question, right? And I think the key question is, when is it going to be better? And I think it's actually not so far away, right? Yeah, there will be mistakes, but also existing teams do mistakes, even really, really bad mistakes.
The challenge as well is how we react to society. You're not wrong. Your example is apt. If every year the equivalent of 200 full airliners crashing into the side of a mountain, that many people are killed in the United States on the roads, which we just accept this as there's no way to change this, the end. Yet when someone dies, when an autonomous vehicle is involved, it makes the headline for weeks on end. There are massive lawsuits. Disproportionate attention is paid to this. It's not just that it has to be better, which objectively, fewer people die when the computer drives than with humans drive, even in these early days. But there is still a persistent and systemic distrust of the computer driving as opposed to objectively worse at it human beings doing it.
Agree. Again, there's a hype for AI and there's a hype against AI, right? So we have to hide the hype in both sides. Right?
Indeed.
And the truth is in the middle, right? Which is, and I think that's the key question. How do we measure when the AI systems actually become better than the average engineers? And then we actually, I mean, for most cases, it is better to let them actually do the first line, right?
I agree. There are ways to use generative AI today in security that objectively improve the situation and raise the tide. I'm not going to name the names on vendors on this because my default baseline that I want people to take is, okay, you're mentioning this is AI powered. I am now highly skeptical. How are you going to assuage the concerns? And there are legitimate answers to that. That is the job of people who are going to market with AI-powered things. I'm not saying that this is an impossibility and should never be used. I'm saying that you have to think about this, and you have to approach with a very strong degree of skepticism. And again, this is all about trade-offs. That is security. The answers have to be compelling enough that it's not just a purchase decision driven by the AI label on the side of it. But you make an excellent point.